A reading from the Hebrew Scripture. At that place, Elijah came to a cave and spent the night there. Then the word of the Lord came to him, saying, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He answered, "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away." He said, "Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Now there was a great wind, so strong that it was splitting mountains and breaking rocks into pieces before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound of sheer silence. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. Then there came a voice to him that said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" He answered, "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away." Then the Lord said to him, "Go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus. When you arrive, you shall anoint Hazael as king over Aram. Also you shall anoint Jehu, son of Nimshi, as king over Israel. And you shall anoint Elisha, son of Shaphat, of Abel-Meholah, as prophet in your place. Whoever escapes from the sword of Hazael, Jehu shall kill. And whoever escapes from the sword of Jehu, Elisha shall kill. Yet I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him." This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
This past week, Chad and I celebrated our 15th wedding anniversary in Puerto Vallarta, Mexico. Sans kids. Which really means two things. We drank our coffee warm, and we slept through the night for 6 days, y'all. And while it's a privilege to be able to escape the demands of everyday life, we were so very grateful for the space to relax on the beach and to read books for the sake of pure enjoyment. As I watched the ocean's waves come in and wash back out, I was reminded and reflected upon how this movement really encapsulates our spiritual experiences. Our journey with God flows back and forth between what 16th century mystic St. John of the Cross would call moments of consolation and desolation. Like waves, they come in and rise up, and they come down crashing upon the shores just to go back out into the sea again. A cycle on repeat, a reality bound to occur, a rhythm to anticipate, knowing our spiritual experiences are rarely filled with only growth and moments of holy intimacy, but instead better understood as journeys, messy, broken, complex, and filled with speed bumps and detour signs along the way, the forward and backward movement. A reality both Peter and Elijah encountered in our scripture texts this morning. I've had a few of my own dark nights of the soul, seasons of desolation, despair, and depression. And perhaps it's unimportant for me to recount what led to those, but it's always good for us to hear from one another the words, "You're not alone." And in good humor, in the spirit of a recent social media meme, this Barbie takes Wellbutrin. From the prophets to the disciples, the pulpit to the pews, life happens to us all. Control remains an illusion, and change is the only constant that we can count on. Our personal and spiritual maturation depends not on if the dark night comes, but how it is that we find our way through. Our vision of vocation in response to God's call despite life's ups and downs. We know very little, actually, about Elijah. His moments of glory end as abruptly as they begin. There's no call narrative to accompany his movement, no backstory to understand how he gets from the unsettled territory east of Jordan, Gilead, to the heart of the northern kingdom of Israel. He's given the title Troubler of Israel from Ahab, carrying the blame for a multi-year drought that Israel is experiencing. Ironic, given the fact that the kingdom of Israel and its people are knee-deep in the worship of the Canaanite god of rain and fertility, Baal. Ahab was the seventh king of Israel, the son and successor of King Omri and the husband of Jezebel of Sidon. Political marriage that led to the death of many of Israel's prophets and the infidelity of its people. King Ahab is described to do more evil in the eyes of the Lord than any of those before him. And it's here where we find Elijah sent to vocalize what Ahab's silence condoned, that there is consequence to the people's infidelity to God's covenant. Elijah instructs Ahab to gather all the prophets of Baal and Asherah at Mount Carmel and challenges them to a showdown of epic proportions, a showdown that would rival any Marvel blockbuster. And while the battle settles the question of who controls the rain, it doesn't seem to settle the question of worship in Israel, as the hearts of the people remain relatively unchanged. Upon hearing from Ahab all that Elijah had done, Jezebel sends a messenger to proclaim that his death is imminent. He immediately flees from Jezreel to the most southern point of Judah, Beersheba. Elijah chose to flee to the wilderness, fueled by some amount of fear, and I would contend an unhealthy dose of pride. As he journeys deep into the wilderness, both physically and spiritually, Elijah pleads for God to just take his life. And as I spent time with this story, I found myself quick to judge Elijah, wondering how on earth he could so easily go from being the star of a superhero-like showdown to a lifeless and despondent victim under a broom tree. And then I recalled my own dark nights of the soul and how easily those raw emotions entangled and entrenched my heart and the havoc they caused to my mind and my body and my soul. Like waves of the ocean, they rise up and come in and crash down. Desolation is a reality bound to occur, a rhythm we can anticipate. Despair, Thomas Merton suggests, is the absolute extreme of self-love. Our despair is born when we realize that our own resources fail us. And because our own resources always inevitably fail us, Merton says, we are all more or less subject to discouragement and despair. And if we're honest, most of us are pretty quick to judge others' dark nights of the soul, and sometimes go even a step further, offering unsolicited comments and advice that are usually wrong and probably always misplaced. In this line of work, I've come to understand that it's impossible to truly know the inner working of someone else's pain and sorrow. In her teaching on empathy, Brené Brown says, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection. The wilderness of Beersheba was a place where many before Elijah had profound spiritual encounters and connections with God. Isaac and Jacob both heard from God in dreams they had at Beersheba. Hagar, a non-Israelite like himself, had one of the most intimate and beautiful encounters with God in the wilderness of Beersheba, where she names God El Roi, the God who sees. Maybe Elijah was desperate for his own encounter with God, or perhaps he longed to be fully seen and known. Maybe Elijah purposely chose to flee to the wilderness, a place full of its own risk, where none of the usual life supports can be found except those provided by God alone, because he realized his own resources had failed him, and he hungered for a connection. His body failing him, Elijah falls asleep under a broom tree, and a ministering angel touches and commands him to get up and eat, providing the initial nourishment needed. He falls asleep a second time, and again the angel commands him to get up and eat. And after his body is fully refreshed, he makes the 40-day and 40-night journey to the Mount of Horeb, the Mount of God, the same mountain where God appeared to Moses and made a covenant to God's people. Now, there's no question that Elijah had lost perspective. The Elijah we find here is a burned-out prophet. Yet God meets him in his moment of need and right where he's at, and he graciously asks, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Elijah's answer reeks of ego-driven zealousness and an overvaluing of his own significance. Claiming to be the only faithful one left, he conveniently forgets the 100 others that Obadiah, keeper of Ahab's palace, 2 chapters before revealed that he had hid and fed in a cave, as well as the servant he left behind before making his journey deep into the wilderness. You see, in his despair, Elijah chose isolation. But God commands Elijah to go and stand on the mountain as a series of theophanies begin. A hurricane-like wind, an earthquake and fire. But what draws Elijah's obedience is the sheer sound of silence. An unmitigated, thin, clear, pure absence of sound moves Elijah's physical body toward God, yet his spirit remains unmoved. Elijah seems to be very unimpressed with God's majesty, and his complaint remains the same. His heart remains anchored in self-degradation and desolation, and God just doesn't have time for it. You see, consolation doesn't always feel good. God doesn't offer Elijah any sense of reassurance. Instead, God tells him to get back out there, to go and do. Life is a steady stream of transitions, of resignations and recommissioning, of doubt and despair, of faith and humility. The way to God is down. are the words Parker Palmer uses to describe his experience of depression. He says, I had always imagined God to be in the same general direction as everything else I valued, up. I had to be forced underground before I could understand that the way to God is not up but down. The underground, Palmer says, is a dangerous but potential life-giving place, a place where we come to understand that self is not set apart or special or superior, but is a common mix of good and evil, dark and light. A place where we can finally embrace the humanity we share with others. That is the best image I can offer, not only of the underground, but also of the experience of God. On the same mountain where God made that covenant with Moses, God reestablishes a relationship with Elijah and reveals God's self with power and clarity. Elijah is affirmed in his prophetic vocation and challenged by the implications of that new responsibility. God gives Elijah hope that he will not stand alone, but that there will be 7,000 others like him who will faithfully stand alongside. And Elijah receives this with a posture of the heart that sees and hears God as he finds his way through, and maybe in Parker Palmer's words, as he finds his way down. You see, when we make room for silence, we may find God, but more often than not, it's we who are found. Our lives, like the waves of the ocean, are lived vacillating between desolation and consolation. The dark nights of the soul will come. So then, is it possible for us to build our interior lives in such a way that when they do come and we're thrown into desolation, we have the wisdom to sort out the inner noise and turbulence? Can we cultivate and nurture the habits of the heart that keep our ears attuned to God's whispers? It's a mighty task, maybe a lifelong one that requires a long obedience in the same direction. But as Nietzsche said, perhaps it's what makes life worth living. As the new school year begins, alongside our shiny backpacks and back-to-school shoes, which you're never too old for, sharpened pencils and crisp notebooks, perhaps we can also try on a new habit of the heart, listening to God, increasing our awareness of self and divine activity in the world, recognizing our vocation and our responsibility to one another. It's impossible to stand up here and to pretend to know where any of you land on this spectrum of human experience. My guess is that we'd fall along the continuum. Instead, I want to invite you to help make this place a place where we can come exactly as we are. Let's make it okay to come into this space and not feel like we have to pretend that everything is perfect, that we are perfect, that our families are perfect. Let's commit to making sure that when you are here, it's okay to not be okay and mean it. As KJ Ramsey writes, "I'm not okay is sacred speech, and help is a full-on prayer." But you know what? If on any given day we find reasons to celebrate, let's find the joy deep within ourselves to do just that, because life, as we know, is both and rarely experienced as either or. Wilshire, let's be a church that doesn't just respond to one another, but connects. And if we can do that, I imagine we will all find our way through.